Judges chapter 12. If you don't have a Bible, what are you doing? You know, one of the greatest ploys of the enemy against the work of the church, which is to reach the world, is to get you fighting amongst yourselves. Right? Division is an inside job. And we shouldn't be ignorant of his devices. I think that so often our greatest work is plagued by the dissension that he brings. We're supposed to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, but man, if you can get the church fighting amongst themselves, that work never gets done. And whatever the world sees, they don't want, because we don't look like a people that have it together very well. So I wanted to take you here to a very obscure story. Maybe you have known it, maybe you don't. All of 7 verses here in Judges 12. But it's one of those messages that the setup is longer than the message. So let me set it up for you anyway. The book of Judges chronologically follows the book of Joshua. The book of Deuteronomy only spans 70 days, right? 40 days Moses gives his final address, 30 days the people mourn, and that's the whole book of Joshua. What follows in the book of Joshua is 25 years. That's all you get. Not much time covered. 7.5 years, Joshua leads the people into what were then 3 very significant battles, both in the middle, in the north and in the south of the country, that literally eliminated 31 kings and city kings, if you will, that allowed them, the Lord, to divide the land amongst the tribes and say to them, get rid of the enemy, right? Your job is to clear your area. And the tragedy, obviously, in the next 17.5 years, as Joshua continued to be alive in his leadership, was that they didn't do so. And so the generation that follows Joshua's death was a generation that really didn't know the Lord. They didn't know his power. They hadn't experienced his hand. Failure on the part of parents to tell their kids, certainly failure on the part of the parents to do what God had said. But then you get to this book of Judges, and it covers huge portions of history. In fact, aside from the book of Genesis' historical presentation to us, the book of Judges covers the single greatest span of years that you'll find in the Bible. 340 years cover the books of Judges all the way up to the time of the kings, King Saul, about, 1040 or so AD. 410 years of combined rulership, if you look at how the judges overlap. But it is a book of great significance because being the largest portion of God's presentation to us, and it didn't take us long for the kings to rule. It didn't take us long for the kingdom to be divided. We don't really have history of the 400 years before Jesus came. So this huge amount of years that is sometimes raced by and sometimes kind of slowly passed before us is a book that talks to us about the failure of man to put God first. And what kind of life do you have when God is put out of the picture? It's the most depressing book, I think, one of them in the Bible. In fact, the last 5 chapters of this book are horrible. Probably a great bunch of chapters for Americans to read because it literally says this is the kind of life you can expect if you don't want God involved at all. And it is a kind of a reflection of that, if you will. But with Moses, the children of Israel got their identity, right? They became a national identity. They were brought out to the borders of the promised land. Joshua brought them in, if you will. But by the time that Joshua dies, much of the land was still in the hands of the enemy. The land represented a spirit-filled life. It doesn't represent heaven, obviously. Heaven isn't a place where you run into enemies. That's where all the enemies are gone. But this is spirit-filled living, right? This is how you walk with God. And yet what you find is that the people of God allowed the enemy lots of room to move. And so by the time you get to Judges, there is this overwhelming narrative of repeated issues where the nation doesn't do very well at all. They spend years and years of time separated from God, but they're God's people. The old syndrome, right? There's 7 of them that Judges covers in great detail, sometimes in 1 verse, sometimes in 4 chapters. People rest. And rather than worshiping God, they misbehave because everything's going fine. need to go to church, I don't need to pray, I don't need to seek the Lord, I don't need His Word, I don't need His promises. And rebellion sets in. Whatever that form it takes, and it usually took the form of worshiping different gods or just living like the world. And God loves them enough and loves us enough to bring retribution because He doesn't want you to stay where you're at. It's like disciplining your kids. And God brings discipline. And it was always in the form of captivity, right? Someone would come and grab you and tax you and mistreat you, and life would get hard. The way of a sinner is hard. It was hard. And sometimes in 6 or 7 years, sometimes in 40 years, some knuckleheads took a long time to wake up. God was cried out to, and the Lord responded by sending a judge. There are 15 of them, I think, if you run through to Samuel in the next couple of books. But needless to say, these were, for the most part, not all of them, godly folks who set the tone, who led the people back to the Lord, and they went from retribution to repentance, and then God brought a deliverance to them, a restoration, if you will. We stick with the R words. And then they would have rest again. And then this whole thing would just start over again. It was monotonous. In fact, you get tired of reading what you can read in chapter 13, the next chapter, when you read about the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord again. I mean, it's the worst, verse in the book, if you will, aside from there was no king in Israel at that time, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. So the narrative through the book, it's like I said, covers more years than any other period that you have in your Bibles. The text that I want to look at with you this morning is an incident that took place in the final years of a fellow named Jephthah. He was the 9th judge of the 15. He only ruled for 6 years. Our lessons, though, would come from his enemies, or what he faced, if you will, while he served the Lord. Jephthah was born to Gilead, who was out messing around with his wife with a prostitute. And Jephthah was the child that came from this prostitute. Gilead was married. He had a lot of other kids. As they began to grow up, Jephthah was kind of rejected by the family. You're kind of the odd man out. And he rebelled early. He took a bunch of worthless guys, and he went running around the country, got really good at fighting, maybe even defending sometimes the Jews and their territory. But he really wasn't a part of the family. He was rejected until the Gileadites were attacked by a group called the Ammonites, and they were overwhelmed. And so they send for this fellow Jephthah. They said, well, could you just bring your dudes and fight for us? We hear you're really good. And Jephthah said, I don't think we've had a relationship much up to this point. And he really, I guess he didn't believe that their love was very genuine, but he made him a deal, said, look, I'll tell you what, I'll come defend you. If I win, I want to rule. And he thought that was good enough for him. So Jephthah fought, and he won, and he came to rule. Jephthah was a really good overseer. He is mentioned by Samuel in chapter 12 of 1 Samuel as a man that God used. He is mentioned in the Hebrews 11 roll of faith, right? The hall or the honor roll of faith. He is probably best known for that vow that he made to the Lord. You might remember before he went into this battle saying, Lord, if you give me victory, whatever comes out of my house, I'll sacrifice to you. And you might remember that his daughter came out of the door. I think there are good arguments to say he didn't kill his daughter. Not for this study, so I'll let you work on that on your own. Can't leave you without homework. But suffice it to say, it was that battle with the Ephraimites that now present themselves before us and bring us to that issue of division and what the enemy would like to do. So Jephthah arrives home victorious. He's going to be the leader. He's been brought home by his family that has rejected him. God has given him great victory over the Ammonites. And when he arrives, we read in verse 1, then the men of Ephraim gathered together, and they crossed over towards Zaphon, and they said to Jephthah, why did you cross over to fight against the people of Ammon and did not call us to go with you? We will burn your house down on you with fire. And Jephthah said to them, my people and I were in a great struggle with the people of Ammon, and when I called you, you did not deliver me out of their hands. So when I saw that you would not deliver me, I took my life in my hands and crossed over against the people of Ammon, and the Lord delivered him into my hand. Why then have you now come this day to fight against me?" And Jephthah gathered together all of the men of Gilead. They fought against Ephraim, and the men of Gilead defeated Ephraim because they had said, "You Gileads are nothing more than fugitives of Ephraim among the Ephraimites and among the Manassites." And the Gileadites seized the fords of the Jordan before the Ephraimites arrived. When any Ephraimite sought to escape and said, "Let me cross over," the men of Gilead said, "Are you an Ephraimite?" And they would say, "No." And he said, "Well, then say the word Shibboleth." And they couldn't pronounce it. They just said Sibboleth. They couldn't pronounce it right, and they would take him and kill him. And that day of the Ephraimites, 42,000 were killed. That's a lot of killing. And Jephthah judged Israel for 6 years, and he was buried along with those in the city of Gilead. I think any time that a nation experiences a civil war, it is a dark spot upon their history. Certainly it was on ours, because now you're not fighting a common enemy, right? Now you're not standing against someone who's coming against you. Now you're destroying yourself. It is worse when the civil war happens in the church, in the congregation, in ministry groups, sometimes in denominations. This fighting that just won't let up, and it isn't an enemy. We're not standing against the devil and his ways. We're destroying each other. That's what was happening here in a time when the nation was, if you will, away from God, and Judges becomes this template for what is life like culturally and socially amongst people that have decided God's not a part. When Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he wrote to them primarily the first letter because of the tremendous division that was taking place in the church. And he doesn't beat around the bush. I mean, goodness knows, the church was a mess. Chapter 1, 1 Corinthians, verse 11. "It has been reported to me, brethren, that from those in Chloe's household, that there are contentions among you, that you say, some of you, I am of Paul, or I'm of Apollos, or I'm of Cephas, or I'm of Christ." And Paul gets right to the point and says, look, it sounds to me like in the church there at Corinth, there is much strife amongst the saints over ministry style. Because all the people they mentioned were good guys. But approaches were different, and personalities were different, and preferences were different. I can imagine someone saying, I like Paul best. He's such a broad kind of based guy. He's a Jew, and yet he has lots of Roman Gentile kind of exposure. He's a man of the world. He's a real intellectual. When he teaches, I'll show up. And someone else saying, no. Apollos is your guy. Part of the teaching team. He can speak. He's such an orator. Man, I could listen to him all day. I don't know if you ever heard Chuck Swindoll speak. He used to live down the street from where I live. But he could paint with words. I mean, the guy was as good as everybody I've ever heard, making, black and white turn to color when it comes to examples. I suspect that Apollos is like that. They said he was quite the orator. I prefer him. And then someone else said, no, I like listening to Peter, Cephas. He's a blue-collar guy. He's one of us. I can relate to everything he said. He's simple. I love his fishing stories. My brain doesn't hurt after I listen to him. Paul drives me nuts, but Peter, he's the guy. In the church, God using people, fighting amongst themselves. And then the worst group of all, no, we're of Christ. Really, Mr. Spiritual Boy, are you for Christ? Yeah, we don't follow any man. No teacher, no leader, no biblical expositor. We just belong to Christ. Baloney. But Paul's point was fairly clear and fairly, I think, straightforward. There shouldn't be any division into the church. But civil war in the church, that's horrible, isn't it? Because it destroys our witness. And your joy, your effectiveness. It's amazing how, because we live in Southern California, we just watch people run back and forth in churches so often, you know. Somebody get mad, go to the next church. You can get mad all year and never run out of churches. We have a church in Wisconsin, a church that we planted years ago, and if you get mad at us, there's really no place to go. Now, there's a couple of churches, but you don't want to go there. Nobody brings a Bible. We're about the only Bible church in town, so we can make you mad and you can't go anywhere. It's kind of good. But there's this running, right? This civil war. And it certainly happened in Jesus' day. I mean, the disciples fought for 3 years about who was going to sit next to Jesus when he took over. In fact, that was such a bad deal. They argued at the Last Supper. And when Jesus a couple of times said, "What are you talking about?" They said, "Oh, nothing. Nothing that you need to be concerned about, Lord." As they're, playing rock, paper, scissors for jobs. A couple of the boys brought their mom in at one time, right? And you read there that everyone was mad because I suspect they hadn't thought of it first, or their mom wasn't game or something. We speak even in the church. I've been pastoring almost 40 years. I don't know how many times I've spoken about division in the body and how destructive it is and what God would rather have. And I'm not sure it does any good. I really don't think I've gotten anywhere. Because I see it in our church. I don't know. I'm not here enough to see it in yours, but you could probably tell me about it. It just seems to permeate, right? It's Satan's greatest tool against the work of God. You might remember those boys coming to Jesus and telling him that they caught a guy casting out demons who didn't belong to the club. And then they proudly said, "We told him to stop." And Jesus, "What are you doing? If they're not against us, they're for us. And by the way, where do you get that power to do that anyway? Not from your little group." Paul calls Peter out in Antioch. It was a doctrinal issue, probably worth having the conflict. Paul and Barnabas, got in a fight and was pretty hairy, I think, for a while, went opposite ways. The disciples fought about position. Never any good. And here you find the same thing, the accusation of one group of Jews against another group of Jews. God's people fighting amongst themselves. Carnal, wicked, selfish, and extremely, according to verse 7, destructive. Or verse 6. There was a comedian years ago named Emo Phillips. Anybody remember who that guy is? I don't know if you do or not. But he wasn't a believer, obviously, but he was a pretty sarcastic comedian, which means I liked him right away. And he talked of a story of a conversation that he had at a coffee shop with a guy one time, and he said they were talking. He said, "Are you a Christian?" And the fellow said, "Yep, I'm a Christian." And he said, "I am too. Are you a Catholic or a Protestant?" Emo asked him. He said, "Well, I'm a Protestant." He said, "Well, me too." And then he said, "What franchise do you belong to?" And he said, "Well, I'm a Baptist." He said, "Good, me too. Northern Baptist or Southern Baptist?" He said, "Southern Baptist." He said, "Me too." And this went back and forth like that for 5 minutes. They were so happy to know each other. And finally, Emo said to his fellow, "Okay, so let me get this right. You are a Northern Conservative Fundamentalist Baptist from the Great Lakes region. Are you from the Council of 1879 or 1912? And the fellow said, "I'm of the Council of 1912. And Emo stood up and said, "Die, you heretic." I think that's the way it works. That's how the fights go. You've probably heard the story. I always enjoyed it about a fellow that they rescued off a desert island. He'd been there 30 years. And the rescuers found him. He was waving. He was so happy to be found. And they looked on the island. There were these 3 huts. And the rescuer said, "What the huts about?" And he goes, "Well, that first one, I lived there." He said, "The second one," he says, "I go to church there." "How about the third one?" He says, "Well, I used to go to church there." Fights. Not helpful. So look, verse 1, Ephraim was in the middle of the country, and now after the victory, after the end of Jephthah's ministry, after God had used him mightily, after the oppression of their people had been overthrown, after, there had been a work of God done, now they come, these guys from Ephraim, upset that they couldn't share in the glory. And the response was pretty straightforward. We're going to just burn you in your house. Friendly folks. Ushers probably. No. I've noticed over the years that one mark of spiritual carnality is that you are easily offended. And we shouldn't be that. It's kind of like a baby. A baby doesn't seem to need reasons to cry. They just cry. And then it's up to you to figure out why. Are they hungry? Are they wet? Are they tired? Do they want to be held? Are they bored? Easily offended. I think about that fellow Diotrephes there in 3 John, isn't it? Verse 9, where it says that he always loved to have the preeminence among people. He wanted to be the center of attention, or else he was upset. He was driven by ambition. His distinction was his ambition. So here's a people, Ephraim, who missed out on the glory of the battle that was won by faith in the Lord and God's blessing, who now wanted to share in it after the victory was sure. While the battle or the outcome was far less certain, while the cost could have been extremely high, they didn't show up. This could go bad. This could cost us plenty. So we stepped back. And they didn't come. But the minute the victory is had, they want some credit for the victory. Paul, when he wrote to the Corinthians about taking communion, you might remember the portion there in 1 Corinthians, I think it's chapter 11. But he talked to them about, he said, when you come together as a church, I hear there are divisions among you. In part, I believe it. This church is a lot more than us than we think. He said there have to be factions among you so that those who are approved could be recognized, which I thought was a very interesting line. When there's strife, you can always tell the people that are really walking with God, they come to the top. The factions show who they are walking with their flesh, and then those who can get around it are doing well. But he said, as he wrote there in 1 Corinthians 11, when you come together in one place to eat the Lord's Supper, when you come to eat, each one of you is taking his own supper before someone else, and someone is hungry and the other person is drunk. And don't you have houses to drink in and houses to eat in? And why do you despise the place of God? And how shame is this? I can't praise you for this. And then he says, so when you come together to have the Lord's Supper, eating the bread, drinking the cup, in an unworthy manner, you're guilty of his body and of his blood. Why? Because there is this division, this selfishness. The big question for the Corinthians at communion was, what about me? For this reason, many are weak. Some of you have died, have fallen asleep. So judge yourself so you don't be judged. But I see that these folks from Ephraim are much like the Corinthians. Their self-interest drives them over the care of others. And I think that's certainly a mark of what happens to us when we come to church, and rather than coming to bless and to be merciful and to serve, we come to be served. And I'm amazed at reading in verse 1 that these bruised egos now come with threats. It wasn't enough to just say, we were left out, we feel bad. No, I'm going to burn your house down. These guys are not reasonable, I guess. They're unwilling to listen, to reason. Notice in verse 2 that it is Jephthah who said, I called you. You didn't show up. You were welcome to be a part of what God was doing. You didn't want to. So we've defeated the enemy. God has blessed us. We had to risk our life to do it. So I don't know why you're here fighting me now. This is kind of after the fact, isn't it? This is silly. This makes no sense whatsoever. But instead of listening to reason, in verse 4, they turn to insults. They start to say to the folks, look, we are bitter because even your army is just a bunch of fugitives from our tribe. Those guys came from us. Now they're with you. Ridiculous picture. I saw, it was kind of a drawing, but it was also a kind of a statement. It had a little picture, but I saw a caption and a picture of a wedding, and the crowd was standing, and everybody turned around and looked down the aisle because the bride was coming, into the wedding, and they stood to greet her. And when she came in, her dress was all torn, and she had a black eye, and there were mud on her new heels, and she was crying uncontrollably. It looks like she'd been in some kind of a fight. And the caption said, "Jesus and his bride. Doesn't she deserve much better than this?" And I thought, that really is, I think, the way we present the bride sometimes. We just beat each other up and go, "Here, our Lord. Look at us now." So these guys from Ephraim were an interesting lot. Maybe you don't remember unless you've been reading the book of Judges, but years earlier, God had used a fellow named Gideon to deliver the children of Israel from the Midianites. You remember that? And in fact, if you can look back, I can show you real quick. Let's see, where is it? Verse 24 of Judges chapter 7, it says this, "And then Gideon sent messengers throughout all of the mountains of Ephraim. And he said this, 'Come down and fight against the Midianites, seed them from the watering places as far as Bethbara and the Jordan.' And all of the men of Israel gathered together, and they seized the watering hole, and they captured 2 princes of the Midianites, Oreb and Zeeb." There's some couple of names for you that have children on the way. "And they killed both of them, they beheaded them, and they actually sent the heads down to Gideon." Verse 1 of chapter 8, "But the men of Ephraim said to him, 'Why did you not call us to go down and fight with you?' And they reprimanded him sharply. And he said to them, 'What you have done what have I done in comparison to what you have done? It's like I've just gleaned the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiathar. God has delivered into your hands these 2 princes. What was I able to do in comparison to you?' And their anger towards him subsided when he said that." So here's the same issue. If you read earlier in chapter 7, Gideon said to these guys, "Come fight." And they went, "Nah." And when he finally chased the people down into their area, he goes, "Could you help me grab the people that were going through your town?" They grabbed 2 guys and they beheaded them. And then they came angry in verse 8, or chapter 8, verse 1. "Hey, why don't you call us?" Same idiot attitude. Now, Gideon was a nice guy. He was diplomatic. He was a politician, I guess, in many ways. He was more of a diplomat, and he couches his answers by saying, "Man, what we did was insignificant compared to the crucial, contribution that you brought." And his soft answer turned away their wrath. But Jephthah is no Gideon. Jephthah was a dude that was thrown out of town, remember? He grew up fighting in the streets. This guy didn't ever run into a fight he didn't like. And he wasn't about to walk away. So back in our story, instead of, listening to these guys, "I'm going to burn down your house and you left us out," verse 4 tells us that Jephthah just got his army together and went, "Well, I guess we're going to take these guys who are accusing you of, running from their army into our army. I guess we'll go to battle. We'll go to fight." And he doesn't follow the actions of diplomacy. He just, let's fight. You want to fight? Let's fight. But Ephraim becomes to me this picture of people who like to come in at the end of the sacrifice of others and stand and share in the glory. And Jephthah's a good guy. I mean, every place that you find him, you can add that to your riddle of the offer of his daughter for sacrifice. Every place you find him in the Bible, he's an honorable, upstanding, godly man who is not rebuked in any way for anything that he does, even to the point of the Lord mentioning his life in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, or Samuel's testimony of him. So the battle takes place. These brethren begin to flee. Jephthah places his armies at the fords of the river of the Jordan, where they would have to cross to go back to their territory, and they got there before the army of the Ephraimites did, and they just blocked their way, and they began to interrogate everybody that wanted to cross and talk to them about being Ephraimites, and they applied a phonetics test to them. The word shibboleth just means stream. Just say stream. Here, we're crossing the stream, just say it. They couldn't say it. They couldn't get the words together. The SH sound, wasn't easy for them. If you've ever been to Israel, there's a place at the headwaters of the Jordan in the north called Banyas. But that's really not the name. The place was built for the god Pan. And it really was called Panyas for years until the Arabs took over, and they can't pronounce the P. So it became Banyas. And to this day, all of the signs say that for the influence of the Arabs in the area. I was born in Holland. We have words that people have a hard time saying because we're all over the place. I have a friend who speaks Swahili they make sounds I've never been able to make with my mouth. And they just roll out, So I think it was one of those kind of things. But the point is, here's the deal. After this battle is over, verse 6 tells us that 42,000 Ephraimites are dead. Look what a small seed of jealousy produced, right? A civil war amongst God's people. In the body, it's that small member known as the tongue, right? That no man can tame. I don't know if you've ever looked at snails, but snails have this really long, narrow tongue that have about 30,000 teeth on it. Now, they're very microscopic. You could see them with a magnifying glass. But they're so sharp that they can saw through stems and leaves. It'll take them a while. But that tongue it destroys everything in its path. And here's a picture, at least in 7 verses, among God's people at a time when they weren't walking with him. And so here's life without God in the midst. The result of this civil war is tragic. And the worst thing is, it was avoidable. It's avoidable, isn't it? This didn't have to happen. These guys had to mouth off, and it cost them their lives. Look what the tongue is a little member and boasts great thing. Look what a great forest fire, a little fire kindles. Isn't that what James wrote? So how important that you and I be careful about how we handle each other dealing with the bride of Christ. Because the enemy wants to slow the work down, right? To nothing. He'd like to shelf you all. And the best way to do it is usually for men, not outward pressure. But when outward pressure doesn't work, then it goes internal. Book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah began to build the wall, for a long time, the enemy that continued to grow in numbers would yell and scream, the wall's going to fall down, and the fox going to jump on it, and it's crooked, and the priests were making it, and they had more, mud on themselves than they did on the work that they were doing. Nobody was really qualified to do this, but God used them, and they continued to move until the pressure came from within. And the enemy began to say to people working on the wall who lived by them, when you least expect it, you're going to die. We're going to be hiding in the bushes. You better watch over your shoulder. And the people began to repeat amongst themselves what the enemy was saying. And then as they turned the corner and fought that through, the biggest hurdle for the building of the wall was a famine came into the land. Chapter 5, I think, of Nehemiah. And the famine that came in, it caused people to have to sell their land, sometimes enslave themselves so they could eat. And Nehemiah was furious because most of this stuff was happening amongst themselves. People were selling themselves to one another and demanding payment. And he came out and said, "What in the world are you doing? We're destroying ourselves. Stop charging interest. Let people go free. We're in this together. To the extent that you can help. Because the enemy's greatest work so often is to just get you to turn on yourself. What's the old line, during civil wars, Satan doesn't take sides. He just provides ammunition to both and cheers you on. They were not the last ones left lying along the roadside, but there were a lot. 42,000. If we could bless but not curse, if we could be humble and not seek glory, if we could concern ourselves with God's glory, not our own, we get a lot of works done, right? But you find this fight, and it happens among Calvary Chapel. It's happening now. It's ridiculous. It should stop. I don't think there's a Calvary Chapel sign in heaven. It just says, those who believe in him. They'll have a lot of Jesus signs up. When Nadab and Abihu, you remember those two sons of Aaron there in Leviticus chapter 10. Gathered with the people on the first day that the Lord was going to light up the offering, right? It was the first time after all of the building and giving of the law that they were going to come and worship the way God intended. And everyone was on their face, and the Lord from heaven sent fire, right, out of the tabernacle and lit the place of sacrifice. These two men lit their censers and began to run around, and they called it profane or strange fire. And as they ran around, the fire jumped out of the place of sacrifice, and it killed them on the spot. It must have been it was the most glorious day and the worst day all at the same time. And they died, and the Lord sent Moses to say to Aaron, this is what the Lord says to you. And it's a great verse. I think it's my life verse for ministry, chapter 10, verse 3 of Leviticus. The Lord said, if you're going to come near me, I have to be regarded as holy. And the second thing he said, and if you stand before the people, I must be glorified. So if we can keep that in mind, right? God is the one that we honor. He's the one that we lift up. All of the enemy's little deals of getting in between us can go away because you belong to him. And we need to do this together. And there's a lot of room for differences of opinion and preference, like Paul and Apollos and Cephas. That's fine. But there shouldn't be division, should there? Or that fighting that continues to go on over things that are incidental and that would do nothing really but destroy. And here's a picture of it. I mean, here's a man walking with God, serving the Lord, God's hands upon him, and here we've got a group of people that now for the second time in 5 chapters have come to make threats because they like glory. And they'll hate even their own brethren. And this time they ran into a guy that wasn't so diplomatic. This guy took out 42,000 and then they went home. And he dies, but they were all buried. Amazing picture, don't you think? Father, as we sit together this morning, I know that certainly one of the enemy's greatest works against the church is to have us to turn on each other. And we see it in churches, we see it in ministries, we see it in people not wanting to submit to those who are over them in authority, who like to bear tales or gossip or backbite, and so many things that we aspire to, our flesh seems to like, and yet in the bigger picture, it kills us spiritually. It certainly destroys our ability to get your word out there, your name out there, and it destroys our credibility. Because no one's going to listen to a bunch of people just fighting amongst themselves. We watch it in the world. We see it in our politics and in the way that people march in the streets. There should be peace in the church. This isn't a place where the enemy rules. This is the place that God rules, where his name is exalted, where his ways are followed. And Father, that you would give to us as your people a heart to be peacemakers, to bless and not curse, to set out fresh water and not salt out of our mouths, that there wouldn't be catastrophes that can be avoided in our wake, but the church would be blessed beyond measure because here even this morning 150 guys are going to permeate the fellowship with love and blessing and kindness and speaking truth and in a godly way. And the enemy will just have to wait outside, out in the world where he belongs. May you deliver us, Lord, from the destruction that happens within. And may you give us, Lord, victory at a place that we so often are even seeking for it, in our witness, in our collective appearance to the eyes of the world. Keep us from self-destructing. And may we together stand fast in your name for your glory. And may much fruit follow, we pray. In Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, guys. Praise the Lord.